So this video is going to pick up from the end of the two videos that I'd posted on the Spanish-American War. This is the conclusion of the war and the aftermath, which is the main thing I wanted to talk about today. So this is slide 29 if you're looking at the slides. So when the war broke out, the American army was only about 28,000 troops. In other words, it's about half the size of Fort Hood in terms of soldiers, and those were spread out all over the country. And so it required a large volunteer force in order to go fight this war. And one of the people who volunteered very quickly was Teddy Roosevelt. He resigned his position in the as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He came down here to Texas and created what were called the First U.S. Volunteer Cavalry. The Rough Riders was the nickname. And with all the other volunteer forces, they collected up in Tampa, Florida in the summer of 1898. Hot, humid, miserable place, very underdeveloped at that time, no hotels or anything, just kind of a swamp. And then had to put their equipment and everything onto boats that the Navy hastily had ordered and rented from various locations, and went down to Santiago to the main Navy base of the Spanish in Cuba. Remember, the war is about Cuba, and so we're going to go down, invade Cuba. They land, and there's really only one big set of battles, and Teddy Roosevelt is involved in that battle. It's the Battle of San Juan Hill, usually referred to, but it's also Kettle Hill. It's a couple of hills that overlooked the harbor of Santiago. And Teddy Roosevelt is right in the thick of this fighting. People are dying around him. He's running up the hill along with the 10th U.S. Cavalry, which was an all-black cavalry unit. And both units take the hill. And with that, the Spanish fleet has to leave. They really have no choice, because with the hills under control of the United States, they could put cannon up there and sink the ships. So the Spanish fleet leaves the harbor and is immediately sunk by the U.S. fleet when they get out to sea. And so with that, essentially the war is over. The Spanish never really wanted to go to war over Cuba. They had hoped to avoid it somehow, and now they've lost two fleets. They lost their fleet in the Philippines, and then they lost their fleet here in Cuba. They just want the war over, and so that's essentially it. So as a result of that, remember, we had passed an amendment to the Declaration of War that said we would not take any territory in this war over Cuba. So we're not going to take Cuba, but we do occupy it for about 2 years while we are building up a government for them. They had never had one created by the Spanish, and so we had to create that. We had to get schools going. We had to get clinics going. All the things the U.S. Army normally does when we deploy overseas. And so once they had a constitution and a working government, we were going to leave. And one of the last things we did, though, was on a bill for money to pay for all of this, there was an amendment. The Platt Amendment was attached to that bill. And this placed some restrictions on Cuban foreign policy. It's going to kind of backfire on the United States a little bit later, but I want you to understand why we did these policy restrictions. Number one, it said Cuba could not get in debt to foreign countries. The other one said Cuba cannot have foreign countries have military bases in Cuba. So why do we do that? Well, Cuba is only, if you look at this map here, it's only about 90 miles from Cuba to Florida. If Germany, for instance, had a base in Havana, they could very quickly attack the United States. So we couldn't allow that from a national security perspective. Why the debt, though? Well, think about it. If Cuba got heavily in debt with again, maybe Germany, and owed them money and could not pay them, what would happen? The repo man would come in, right? Germany might demand that Cuba allow it access to the ports for its navy or something like that. And so both of these restrictions were meant to prevent national security threats to the United States coming from Cuba. So they made sense from our perspective, but 30 or 40 years down the road, many Cubans are going to look at this as an imposition on them, that they aren't truly independent because the Yankees to the north are dominating them. Not all Cubans will feel that way, but some will, and it'll come to be a problem for us. One of the other things we get is Guantanamo Bay Harbor. You see that here in the map. Guantanamo Bay, we need it because we need coaling bases. We're a worldwide power now. We need these things. And so we get a perpetual lease on Guantanamo Bay. It means we get to stay there as long as we pay the rent. As long as we pay the rent, we got to pay $4,000 in gold every year. And as long as we make that payment, we can stay there in Guantanamo Bay. And so to this day, we still pay that rent on the harbor. Now, if you remember from the video, the previous videos, I said the Philippines is the first battle of the war. About a week after we declare war, we defeat the Spanish fleet in the Philippines. So why the Philippines? If the Spanish fleet left Manila, which is where they were based out of, if they left Manila, we would have no idea where they were until they showed up someplace, because there's no satellites or anything like that. And so the fear was that if they leave that harbor, they could go and attack, say, San Francisco in the United States in a war. We're in a war with Spain. The Spanish fleet is there. And so Roosevelt, while he was still the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, had told Admiral Dewey to go out to Hong Kong, build a navy. We didn't really have much of a navy out there. He had a couple of ships. He had rent some ships and things like that, and put together a navy to go out and attack the Spanish fleet if war came. And so when war was declared, he immediately left Hong Kong Harbor, sailed down to Manila. Everybody assumed they were going to die, right? It was not a very good navy, and it's going up against not the best navy, but a pretty good navy. And everybody just assumed this was a fool's errand for the Americans. They were all going to die. But when Dewey sailed into the harbor, it was a complete surprise, and in a very short battle, he destroyed the Spanish fleet. Only one American was killed in this battle, and he died actually of heat stroke, not of battle wounds or anything like that. And so with that, the war is, or that battle is over. We had achieved our mission. The mission was to destroy the Spanish fleet. And so the question is, what do you do now? And this is where war creates decisions that have unintended consequences. The decision to go attack Manila without clear guidance on what to do next left the U.S. Navy just sailing around that harbor waiting for instructions from the president. And so when the ships are sailing around waiting, the question is, okay, what are we going to do? Are we going to take the Philippines? Are we just going to take Manila Harbor? Should we just sail away? We had accomplished the mission. That's a reasonable decision to make. But we got to make a decision. And so it's in the midst of this war that a fateful decision is eventually made. Now, if you remember talking about this period and the strategic concerns and the growth of the imperialism during this period of time, all the great powers are looking at the Philippines. Spain is a declining power. Germany, Japan, even France are looking at the Philippines saying, we want that place. We want to snatch that up. And so while our tiny little pretty substandard Navy fleet is sailing around Manila Harbor, there are naval ships from all those other great powers eyeballing the island, sailing around, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Now, one option to deal with the Philippines was to give them to Emilio Aguinaldo. He had been fighting for Philippine independence for a number of years. At the time the war started, he was exiled in Hong Kong, and Admiral Dewey had run into him. And so when the fleet was defeated in Manila, Dewey didn't have orders, so he thought, well, maybe Emilio Aguinaldo might be part of the solution of what's going to happen to the Philippines. Are we going to give it to Spain? Is it going to get independence? We don't know. Maybe this is going to be a guy who will play a part in that. And when he comes back, though, he immediately declares independence for the Philippines, sets up a provisional dictatorship, and has an army deployed around the city of Manila. At the same time, the U.S. has some military running Manila, cleaning it up, setting up schools, getting the government working again. And eventually, those two armies are going to run into each other, and we're going to get into a war with Emilio that's going to last until 1901 when he's finally captured. Now, some people will say, hey, why didn't we just give him the keys and leave, right? We didn't go to war for the Philippines. The war is about Cuba, so why not just get in your boats and sail away, give the keys to Emilio before you leave? There's one problem with that, though. And this is an ethnic map of the Philippines. As you can see, it's a very complex ethnic map, and many of those groups hate each other more than they hate any external power. Spain had ruled the Philippines for close to 500 years, but they were an outsider, and so they could kind of work deals with these various groups. Emilio is a Tagalog, which is this red group here. And many of the other ethnic groups hated the Tagalogs more than they hated the Spanish. And so if we handed the keys over to Emilio and said, hey, run the Philippines, what is the reality of what's going to happen? What does he have to do to get control of the Philippines? Well, he's going to have to capture it. He's going to have to build an army up, and he's going to have to conquer the rest of the islands. So in the context of the world situation, what's the reality of what's going to happen there? If we give him the keys, the Philippines are going to be carved up. Somebody else is going to get them. Germany's going to get them. Japan's going to get them. France going to get them, or they'll divide them up amongst themselves, right? So it might sound good, give them to Emilio, he's a Filipino, but you got to understand this complex map in order to make sense that that really isn't a good option. It is an option, it's just not a very good one. As I said, those foreign intrigues going on during this period of time, there is actually a larger German Navy sailing around the Philippines than the American Navy, and they are a much better Navy. They have troops with them. They are ready to take control of the Philippine Islands. And during the course of this waiting period, the German army is going to be very aggressive. They're going to try to ram American ships. It looks like we're going to get into a shooting war with the German Navy. The only thing that stops that is the British Navy getting our back, because they actually had a strong Navy there, and they sort of forced Germany to back down from this attack. So we very nearly came to a war with Germany over this. So what almost certainly would have happened if we didn't keep the Philippines? I feel pretty confident Germany would have gotten all or most of the islands. In the aftermath of the Spanish-American War, you see this red-lined area here. Germany is going to take from Spain that entire region of the Pacific Ocean. That's what makes me feel pretty confident. Had we not taken the Philippines, it's almost certain Germany would have taken them. Now, is that any big deal for Americans? You know, who the heck cares in 1899 who owns the Philippines? Is it, the Germans, the Spanish? Americans have no interaction with the Philippines to speak of, so it's really not important when you think back to those realism type arguments for foreign policy. They're really, at this moment, are not realism arguments. in favor of keeping the Philippines. So why not just let the Germans keep them? Well, if you know anything about colonial powers, you know, nobody wants to be a colony. But if you have to be a colony, you don't want to be a colony of Germany. They're among the worst ones there was. At the time that this is going on, they are committing genocide in Southwest Africa. They have a horrible colony that they're running in East Africa, treating the people horribly. You don't want to be colonized by the Germans. So there may not be a realism type argument, but maybe there is a idealism argument. We can't turn these islands over to the Germans. They're going to treat them horribly. Right? Everybody understand that. So what did McKinley decide? Remember, McKinley never wanted to go to war over Cuba. He had been in the Civil War. He knew what war was like. He just did not want to get involved, but he was sort of dragged into this thing because of the way the Maine had exploded. And so he's also a deeply religious man, and so he prayed on this hard. And as he says on this in this speech that I had you read, he determined these were his options. He couldn't give them back to Spain, right? They had been fighting against Spain for a couple of decades. You know, we had pushed Spain out. It would not be very honorable of us to just give Spain back control over this when they had done such a poor job up to that point. And then he says we couldn't turn them over to France or Germany. Now he focuses on the commercial issues of it, but there's really not a big reason. But it's just seeing, hey, we're going to turn these over to another colonial power to misrule into the future. We couldn't leave them to themselves. They were unfit for self-government, and they would soon have anarchy and misrule. Now, sometimes people will take this out of context to imply that McKinley's really a jerk who doesn't think that they're capable of anything. What he's saying is, if you remember that map I just showed you, he's saying, look, there is chaos there. They've never been trained by Spain on how to have a government. They have no government structure. If we just leave them to themselves, it's gonna be chaos, and then eventually Germany, France, or I would say Japan is gonna come in and snatch them up. So he's not saying they can never rule themselves. They just aren't ready right now. And so ultimately he decided on option number 4. There's nothing left for us to do but take them all. Educate the Filipinos. Remember, we got to get them so they can rule themselves. Educate, uplift, civilize, and Christianize them, and do the best we can for our fellow men. Right? So it's a very much an idealistic notion of what we're going to try to do here. We don't want to do this, but we're just kind of stuck. It fell into our lap. So this is not a question of choosing the best of 2 great options, right? You don't have option A, which is great, and option B that is great, and hey, which one is going to be the best for me? You have crappy option A, and you have crappy option B. And when you have a choice like that, you don't always get a perfect outcome. And so that's what's going to happen here. It's the least worst option is the one he has to choose. So he's not saying, I wanted to do this, I want to take the Philippines. He's saying, of all the choices I have, this is the least worst of them. And so with that, we are going to end up becoming a colonial power, something many Americans never wanted to be. So in the aftermath of the war, we sign an armistice, and then eventually negotiate the Treaty of Paris 1898. You always have to put the year with treaties of Paris because there's so many of them. So just remember Treaty of Paris 1898. And with that treaty, we pay Spain $20 million for the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Now, we haven't even talked about them. Why the heck do we want those places? Because now we're a world power. And if we're a world power in the age of steam, it means we need bases for coal and for stopping of our ships. And so like America normally does, if you lose a war to us, we're going to pay you a bunch of money, right? It really started early in our history. That's the way we do it. Everybody else, if you lose a war, the loser pays for the war. That's the way it works every place in the world, except if you lose to the United States, we pay the loser a bunch of money for, a piece of land or something like that. Now, this was a hotly contested treaty, and many Americans did not favor this thing. And a group formed up called the American Anti-Imperialist League to try to oppose this treaty in the Senate. Remember, treaties have to be approved by the Senate by a 2/3 vote, meaning you got to get a lot of senators on board in order to ratify that treaty. So immediately at the end of that war, though, we go into another war, the Philippine-American War, because now we have to take control of the Philippines. And so we're going to fight, as I said, Aguinaldo for about 2 years. It is a very harsh war in some places. Some places it's not harsh. Some places it goes very easy. That people are happy to see the Americans come in, build schools, clinics, get the government functioning. But in some places it is a very bitter war. But from the beginning, the whole mission is to set up an independent country. It's going to take time, but that is the mission from the beginning. And so by 1907, they have their own legislature to begin to create their own laws. By the 1930s, they essentially are independent, running their own business, and we are just watching their foreign policy and defense, right? So we're just kind of keeping them protected. And the plan was, by the 1940s, give them full independence. The war delays it, so it's not till after World War II, but they finally get independence. They'd been mostly independent, though, already for 15 years. So that was the goal. It took a while to build up the institutions so that they could function, but they're still an independent country today. As you see on the map here and some of the photos of the fighting, some places it goes very easy. As I said, you might be on one island, everything goes smooth. You go on to the next island, it's very harsh fighting. The American Anti-Imperialist League, as I said, was formed in order to prevent this treaty from becoming law. It had a whole gamut of people. You see on this on the slide there, Andrew Carnegie, one of the richest humans ever to live; Mark Twain, famous American writer; Samuel Gompers, the leader of the AFL, American Federation of Labor; and then Grover Cleveland, a former U.S. president, right? So a whole lot of people are opposed to this treaty. Kind of cuts across parties to a degree. It's about that question of, should America become an imperialist colonial power? Okay, from McKinley's perspective, we're forced into this. We got no choice. But many Americans say we need to get out of this business. Why would a guy like Samuel Gompers, a labor union person, be opposed? Now, might be because of ideological reasons, right? Not thinking we should be a colonial power. But I think also, if we bring in the Philippines, what's the problem for U.S. labor union in America? Well, there might be really cheap labor in the Philippines, and maybe that will undercut labor, contracts here in America. Or maybe there'll be a lot of immigration from the Philippines, and that will lower wages here in America. So I think some of those things are playing into it as well. Now, personally, I don't have a problem with people picking one side or the other in this fight. This is a very complex issue, whether we should become a colonial power. The problem I have is, after the treaty is ratified and the U.S. is conducting this war in the Philippines, in the run-up to the 1890 election, the Democrats mostly, but people from this American Anti-Imperialist League, are working with Emilio Aguinaldo to try and keep him fighting against the Americans so that the Democrats could use that as an issue to win the election in 1900. So in essence, they're playing politics with the lives of American soldiers. American soldiers are going to be killed because Emilio is going to keep fighting as long as he thinks he has support from a party that might win the election in 1900. So, you can feel about that how you want. Personally, I see it as a sort of treasonous activity. Now, the election of 1900 is about the Philippines. As you see in this one depiction here, McKinley is raising the flag over the Philippines, and William Jennings Bryan, who's going to be the Democrat candidate, is trying to chop it down. That's really the issue. Should America keep the Philippines? And should we pursue that policy that McKinley had set forth? Now, when you look at Bryan's campaign poster that year, what do you see on this? What is the issues as he sees it? Now, he's got some words on there: equal rights to all, special privileges to none. But just looking at the imagery, what do you see? You see silver and gold, silver, gold, silver, gold, right? What is his big issue? He's still talking about silver and gold. The crown of thorns, that speech I had you read. That's what he's worried about. That's what the Democrats are running on. Nobody cares about silver or gold in 1900. He's running on the past, right? 1896, silver and gold was a big issue. By 1900, we've discovered gold in Alaska, gold in South Africa, gold in Australia. We have more gold than we need, and nobody needs silver anymore, at least at this time. And so nobody cares about it as a political issue. He's going to lose the election pretty soundly. On the Republican side, McKinley is going to choose Teddy Roosevelt as his running mate. Now, the last we talked about Teddy Roosevelt, he was fighting in that battle on San Juan Hill. He comes out of that a national hero. He makes sure everybody knows he's a national hero because that's the type of guy he is, but he is a national hero. He braved people dying all around him in that battle. And when he came back, there was an election for governor of New York, and he ran for governor and won soundly. And he's a clean government guy, right? Just like his dad, he wants to clean up the corruption up in Albany, New York. And so he starts like a hard charger, just working to clean up the corruption. Now, who doesn't like that? Well, the people who benefit from the corruption don't like that. And so the Republican Party machine in New York wanted to get rid of Teddy Roosevelt. They was like, man, he's messing up our good thing. We need to get rid of him. And so they thought, what's the least important job in America? They looked around and they said, Vice President of the United States. There was a vice president in the 1930s who said, the vice presidency isn't worth a warm bucket of spit. And I think that kind of captures it. What is a vice president's job? I mean, he has some minor roles, but what's the big thing? He's simply waiting in case the president dies, right? I mean, that's really it. And most times they don't die. So they figured, we'll put him into the vice presidency. That'll get him out of our hair, and we never have to worry about Teddy Roosevelt again. But how does that turn out for them? Well, about a year later, McKinley's dead, and now Teddy's president, and he's going to be their worst nightmare in the coming period. So, in the aftermath of this war, the election of 1890, again, remember, nobody cares about gold anymore. Bryan is still running on free silver. Nobody cares. We now have worldwide responsibilities because we have the Philippine Islands. We take control of Hawaii. We take control of Wake Island. We take control of Guam. Why do we need all those islands? Because we need a secure line of communication to the Philippines. If you're going to keep the Philippines, you have to have those bases. There's no two ways about it. Even if you don't want Hawaii, you have to take it. So it changes our entire focus. We are no longer simply an American power. We are now an Asian power. So now the things that happen in Asia are important to the United States, right? It matters to us. We have to get involved in those things. And it's going to draw us into things we never would have thought about before as a nation. Now the election, as you see here, the blue in this case is the Republicans, solid win across the North and the West Coast, 65% electoral vote, it's a landslide, 52% of the popular vote, again, it's a solid win, right? What about a 8 percentage point difference there? Solid win for them. Looking at this map, the colors reverse, and you see a lot of weak support for the Democrats in the South, except for Mississippi and South Carolina. Nevada, silver people still like the Democrats, but broad support. In other words, what this map is saying is there is broad support in America for McKinley's vision as opposed to Bryan's vision. And so with that, the insurrection in the Philippines is going to collapse pretty quickly. And in about 2 months, Emilio is going to be captured, and that's the end of that major fighting there. But in the aftermath, as I said, we are now an Asian power. And so the things that happen there directly impact America. And what is happening in China is the same thing that's happening elsewhere in the world, in Africa, elsewhere in Asia. The major colonial powers are carving it up. Now, they aren't colonies yet, but they're taking control, as you see in this map here. The French, the British, the Germans, Japanese, and Russians are all seizing parts of China. And the fear for America now was that if China gets carved up into colonies, and those colonies are controlled by European or Japan, European powers or Japan, the fear is we will no longer be able to trade with China. And that's important because we got a base here in the Philippines. We kind of need to be able to trade with China in order to be successful. We hope to sell manufactured goods to China, all those problems. And so the Secretary of State, John Hay, is going to propose a what we call the open door policy. So essentially he's going to write a letter to all those major powers and say, hey, let's keep China open. Let's not carve it up into colonies. Let's just allow spheres of influence, but we all trade with each other. So the Japanese area of China can trade with the German area, and everybody can trade with everybody. So you have your area where you dominate, but nobody carves it up into colonies. So that's kind of the policy we call the open door policy. And so as a result of that, nobody answers him, right? So he sends out these letters, nobody gets back to him. So a little while later, he sends out another note to everybody, and he says, hey, everybody else is okay with this policy. Are you on board for this policy? So it kind of fools them, because everybody is okay with free trade as long as everybody else is okay with free trade. They just don't want to be the first one to sign on to this policy. But if they think everybody else is okay, then they're willing to jump onto this policy. And so essentially that becomes our policy towards China. It helps prevent China from being carved up. It's the reason it is not cut into colonies. It becomes, Americans begin to see themselves as the protector of China. I think that's important because over the next 40 or 50 years, Americans are sort of psychologically connected to China because of this. We believe it is our duty to protect China from being carved up. And that'll come back after World War II when the communists come to power in China and creates a big scandal. Now, because we are involved in China, though, There was an ongoing rebellion going on. We refer to it here as the Boxer Rebellion. This is a very deadly rebellion. Millions of people are dying. And in the midst of that, Europeans had been trapped in Beijing by these people who were rebelling against various things. And so America is going to send in a small army to help rescue foreigners in Beijing. We're a very small part of it. It's mostly Japanese, Russians, a lot of Germans and British. We're the smallest group, I think. But it's also the first time America has ever done something like this. And you see in the picture there, there's a Japanese depiction of it. You see all the various flags there. In the aftermath of that, putting down that rebellion, the European powers in Japan forced China, the Emperor of China, to pay an indemnity. In other words, losers pay for the war, right? Unless you lose to America, losers pay for the war. And so there was an indemnity forced upon China to pay for the war. They had to give everybody money. America, though, uses our money to build schools in China. So whereas the other people keep the money, maybe buy a new crown or something, the U.S. is going to take the money that we get from the government of China and use it to build schools in China. So we're not going to keep that money. So again, it's a difference in the way America conducts its foreign policy. And so here's a map of the changed American world. We are now an empire, whether we like it or not. We've got worldwide responsibilities. We have the Philippines. We have this chain of islands to give us a secure communication with the Philippines. We've got Puerto Rico out here as a base so that we can protect the areas there. We've got the Navy base there in Cuba. And can you see what else we have to have? We have to have a canal. There's no choice. We have to have that canal because we are a worldwide power. And so the consequences of this war. The Spanish-American War, very few deaths. 379 people die, a bunch from diseases, but in terms of combat deaths, very few. 4,100, it's more deadly in the Philippines. We discover the cure or the cause of yellow fever, so we can now start saving a lot of lives with that. We become a worldwide power, Guam, Puerto Rico, and so on. And so we have to take on a much bigger role in the world, even if we don't want it. And because we are now an Asian power, it's going to foreshadow the war with Japan. It's not that we're going to cause the war with Japan, but because we have the Philippines, we're in the way of what Japan eventually is going to want. And so the only way for them to get what they want is to go to war with us in 1941. And so, tremendous impact in this war. Without the Spanish-American War, we might never have gone to war with Japan in 1941. Can't predict exactly, but probably not. So anyway, that's all we're going to do for today. I'm going to try and get this posted real quick, and then we're going to pick up with the presidency of essentially Teddy Roosevelt here next week after the test.